Good morning, everybody, and welcome to class today. First of all, as we're getting started today, I just want to take a moment and just thank you for watching, right? Like, I know it's like, oh, I'm responsible for the content, so I have to watch. But if you are watching here live with me or watching this recorded a little later on, I just want to tell you thank you for watching, because it is good content. You are responsible for the content, but hopefully you're finding it valuable and useful to help you along your way this semester. So today we're talking about opening up the box model. The HTML box model is the, or HTML/CSS box model is the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. And I will say that this is probably one of the more difficult concepts that students try to grasp every semester, because there is so much involved in the box model. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what the box model is, how we work with the box model, and then we're going to talk about how we can hack the box model a little bit and break the box model. Also, what we're going to do during this live stream is your Module 3 assignments from Module 3 going forward. Those lab assignments are now to be created in CodePen. So we'll have a look at CodePen and how that works, so that when you get started on your assignments, your lab assignments, you'll have an understanding of how to use that. You know, in the first two modules, you made your own file. That's great. That gets you used to making an HTML file. But what I want to do for a lot of the markup is I want you to focus on being able to write the code instead of trying to structure a file. When you get into Web 2.15, we'll do more file structure type stuff. So we'll put a pin in that and we'll come back around to it. For the remainder of the course, we are going to be just examining our markup directly in CodePen. And we'll have a look at that a little bit later on. But first, we're going to talk about the box model a little bit before we move over to that. So I guess the first question that you probably have on your mind right now is just what exactly is the box model? So when we're working in HTML, something that you might have noticed so far, as you were adding little bits of styling to your very basic websites from the first and second modules, you notice that everything's a rectangle, everything's a box. All of our HTML elements that we have on a page, and any HTML page that you see out there, every single element on that page is a box, whether it looks square or not, right? Whether it has these straight edges, whether it looks like a rectangle, it is a rectangle. There is an imaginary rectangle that we can draw on that page around every single element that we put on a website. And in CSS, we use the term box model when we're talking about design and layout. And this is essentially our most standard form of layout, is utilizing the box model, because what we're taking is we're taking those boxes, we're taking those imaginary rectangles that are drawn around essentially everything that's on a website, and we're utilizing them to our advantage to do some work. And we can actually see this box model. Let's see here. What would be the best way for me to try to show you this? Because it was just something that I kind of thought of right here in the moment. So probably the easiest way is going to be for us to just look at a website. So let me just pull my browser up here. And so this is CodePen. We'll circle back around to this in just a little bit. We'll visit the Cleveland Community College website here, clevelandcc.edu. And so it's a lot easier to see on the Cleveland Community College website where the boxes are. And I can actually write a little script here to show you the boxes. Let's see here. So what is it? Control I, Control Shift I. There we go. So this is a good thing to look at as we start out working with the box model anyway, because if you've ever used the inspect element feature of the website to kind of look at the code that's there, one of the things that you can see as you sort of hover over the different types of code in your in the site is actually you can actually see the boxes show up. Like here, I've found the code for that top header. We can see in our HTML, if we zoom into it there, we can see that we have a header container, one of our HTML5 header containers here that we have, and we can hover over it in this inspect element feature to see it in our code. And when we do that, we see these new colors pop up on our screen. And these colors are representing the box and the different parts of the box model. So we have different colors for the content box, different colors for the padding, different colors for the margin, and so on and so forth. And if we go down through here, we can actually see, like here's the div container for that part. We can see our padding in that kind of green color. It's probably difficult for you to see. But we have the margin in orange and the content in like that blue-white there in the center. And as we hover over different elements, we can see the different boxes for all of our different elements. And one of the things that we could do is we could just add a little CSS here where we'll add it to everything. Border. Actually, I need to add a new rule here. We'll add one to everything using our asterisk selector here. And we'll make it border 3px solid red. And so this allows us to visualize all of these boxes a little bit better. And you can see here, and, you know, this code right now isn't important, right? This is just to show you an example of where our boxes are. You can use this to visualize where the boxes are. You can actually see the boxes. So even on things that don't necessarily look like a rectangle, you know, if we look here at the logo, if we look here at this text, if we look at, you know, all these navigation items and everything here, it doesn't necessarily look like a rectangle or doesn't necessarily look like a square at first glance. But by adding this little bit of code here, we can see the box that is surrounding our element. So we can see here that we have this box. We've taken the imaginary box and made it a little more real. We can actually see the rectangle that's surrounding all of our elements. So it's something that's kind of interesting for us to look at this phase in talking about the box model. Because it's essentially these boxes that we're working with as we go forward in sort of laying things out with the box model. And so we use this box model when we're working with all of our HTML elements and laying out the document. And this is going to help us determine the size and the position and some of the properties of these boxes. And so when we're dealing with the box model, there are essentially four main parts of our box model. We mentioned them there when talking about the Cleveland Community College site. We have the content, we have the padding, we have the border, and we have the margin. And one of the ways that I like to talk about this, and we'll kind of get into this a little bit more as we progress, one of the ways that I like to kind of talk about this is this idea of like a house. Right? You've got your, we'll draw a crude house here. I don't like drawing with my mouse. But either way, you've got a house. Right? And you've got this area here. You've got, around your house, you have your yard. And maybe around that yard, you have a fence. And maybe outside of that fence, in between your house and your neighbor's house, you have some kind of forest. Or some kind of space where there's a separation between you and your neighbor. So we can think of these 4 parts of the box model like those 4 parts of our house and yard, right? When we're looking at and we'll get into this a little bit deeper as we progress. But when we're looking at the content, that's essentially the house, right? That's the thing that people notices. That's the thing that people sees. That's your text. That's your pictures. That's your videos. That's, the thing that's on the page that you see. So when we think back to that example that we just did, where we drew those boxes around all of the elements on the Cleveland Community College website, the house would be the stuff that you see there. But then we have the yard, and that kind of is related to the padding, right? Between that content, between that stuff that you see and the edge of that imaginary box. So on the inside of your box, you have your content, and then between that content and the edge of that box on the inside, you have your padding, and that's like your yard, right? You have this space around your house that's not your house. It's just a little bit of space where, you kind of have a little bit of breathing room. You can go out there, you can chill out, you can have, you can drink a cup of coffee, whatever it is. It's still a part of your box. It's still a part of what you have, but it's not the content. It's not space that is something that you can see. So that's the padding. That padding gives you a little bit of breathing room between that content and the edge of that box. Then you have your border, right? And that border is going to be like your fence here. You're going to have something that's just around the edge of your box that defines that boundary. And then finally we have the margin. And that's this part over here outside of your fence. Because our margin is actually outside of our box. The margin gives us a little bit of space between one element and the next element. So when we look at it in this sort of analogy where we're comparing it to our house, it's the space that maybe nobody owns. It's this sort of no man's land in between our house or our yard and our neighbor's yard. So it's that little buffer zone. And one of the things that I try to impress on students every semester is just how important padding and margin are. And we'll talk about this more as we go through the different elements of the box model, but these are 2 incredibly important things that we want to be adding to our elements. Because you can kind of see how things look without it. Right? If you have a page where something is just right up against something else, just as close as it can possibly be, without any of this breathing room from the padding or without any of this breathing room from the margin, everything's just kind of crammed in there. It becomes a lot tougher to read. You're going to end up with a lot better of a website in a design sense if you're including more padding, more margin, just giving a little bit of breathing room between your elements. So as we discuss these concepts, These are two things that are going to be critical for you to add. You know, I don't know how many times when I'm giving feedback to students over the course of the semester, looking at their websites and saying, you need to use more padding here to bring that out from the edge of the box a little bit. Give it a little bit of breathing room. Give it its own space. Your content should have its own space. That's why padding exists. But if you want some help visualizing this, we can look at it in this sort of way. So this helps us to kind of visualize the box model. The inside here we have is our content. That's going to be, you know, the stuff that you can see, the stuff that you can read, right? And then we have this padding. And this padding is on the outside of the content, but it is still defined in the box. It's still a part of the inside of the box, because remember that border is what demarcates the edge of our box. So when we're considering like the calculations, which is going to become a very important part later on, and how we calculate the box model, it's important to remember that our content and our padding are two separate elements that are a part of the same box. So when we define our content and then we define our padding, we'll define width and height on our content, but then our padding will add to that. And then our border will add to that finished width and height of our box, because they're separate entities in terms of our box model. Now, there is a way that we can hack that and bring them together. And we'll talk about that a little later on in the live stream. But when we get started, we're just learning the simple box model. So we want to learn how this works to begin with, and then we can learn how to break the rules. Then on the margin here, it's represented by the yellow stripe. It's on the outside of the box. And that's what's separating this box from the next box. And so I've got these brief definitions here that content is the content of the box, the text, where the text and the images appear. These are all things that I've kind of already said. But we will put it here, right? Just so you have kind of a written version of this that you can see, maybe write down for yourself if you'd like, if you're taking notes. But the content of the box is where the text and the images appear. The padding clears an area around the content. Padding is transparent. So padding is going to take on whatever background color you apply to the content, because it's still inside that box, but it's transparent. You can't see it. So it's extending the size of that box, but it is adding a little more to it, and you can see through it. So whatever the original color is that you prescribe to that box is going to be the color carried forward. Border goes around the padding and the content. And as we'll see, you can declare your own color on border. And then margin clears an area outside the border, and that margin is transparent. So it's going to be whatever is, you can see through it to behind it. And so the big part here is that this allows us to give a border around elements and to define the space between elements. And we start with the content, right? The content area is bounded by an image, or bounded by the content edge, right? So when we looked at that box earlier, right? When we looked at this, what we see here as the white box in the middle, that's the content. Where the content meets the padding here, that's the content edge. So when we talk about the content and we say the content is bounded by the content edge, that is this portion where we have the end of our white rectangle here in the center. And this can contain anything that we see, you know, some kind of text, some kind of image, some kind of video player, something like that. And when we are setting our content, we are defining our content with the width and the height in our CSS. So now that we have this idea of what this part is, let's jump over to a code pen and start to work with this. let's see, we can get rid of that. Now, before we start to do this, let's talk about CodePen and how it works and what we do with it. So after you log into CodePen, which you should have made a CodePen account when you were going through the Begin Here module. After you log into CodePen, you'll see something like this screen here. Now, if you've never done anything on CodePen before, this will look a little bit different because you won't have anything here. What I have here is primarily just examples for classes and things of that nature that I've worked with before with students. And so what you want to do when you create a new CodePen is you're going to log in. You'll get something that looks like this screen here. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see this Create section, Pen, Project, and Collection. We're going to create a new pen, and that's what you're going to be doing for all of your lab projects from here on out, is you're going to be creating a new pen to work with them with. And I'll show you one of the benefits of why we do this in just a moment. So I'm going to click on pen here, and it'll give me a new pen, and it'll look something like this. So one of the first things that you'll want to do when you get to this section is you'll want to give it a name. I'm going to click on that little pencil that's right there beside the name, and I'm just going to rename it Box Model Test. And when I hit enter here to commit the name, I want you to pay attention to what happens up in my URL bar up there. I want you to pay attention to it so much I'm going to zoom in on it. I want you to pay attention to what happens up here in the URL bar when I hit enter to commit this name. So we're going to do that, and we also need to save it. I forgot about that part. Once we save it, look what happens to my URL. It changed. It added this little string of characters here on the end. So once I committed my name and I hit save, it changed. And so when you go to submit your assignments, what you're going to be sending me is you're going to be sending me this URL. Because this URL is going to be unique for the CodePen that you worked on. And so you just send me that URL. I'll get it. I'll be able to click the link, open it up, and see the work that you've done. And that's also another one of the great parts about using CodePen that I like to be able to teach HTML with, is this fact that you can do code here, and then it'll pop up down here at the bottom as you do it. So you get to see as you go along whether or not your code's working without having to save and go back and open the file, save, and then go refresh the file. It's going to do all that work for you. And you can also see we have 3 boxes here, so it kind of gets us into a good practice for the way that we should be writing our files for websites, in terms of having HTML in one section, CSS in another section, and JavaScript in yet another section, which we'll talk about JavaScript a little later on in the semester. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create 2 boxes. I'm going to create 2 boxes for helping us demonstrate this. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a main. So I'm going to use my set of paired main tags, main being our HTML5 main container. You know, you should have read about that in your Module 1 reading. So we take the main part of our website and we put it in between our main tags, because that's that DOM, that's that container that we were talking about back in Livestream 1. And then we'll create a child in here of just a paragraph, P. And to help us out, we will put a little bit of text inside of this paragraph. And I guess I'll share with you one of my favorite things to do when I just need a little bit of dummy text while I'm working on something, is I like to go to lipsum.com, lipsum.com. And this is just a lorem ipsum generator. Lorem ipsum is just some dummy text that you can use to just kind of fill up some space. So we'll get me a paragraph here of lorem ipsum. I can copy that and put it in my paragraph here on my website. And automatically it'll give it a little save and it'll give it a little update, which is why we want to use this. So we have two boxes here. We have one box that's defined by our main tags, one box that's defined by our paragraph tags. And you can see that by default, everything is 100% of the screen wide. So until we declare some CSS rules here, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be 100% of the screen in width. So let's start to add some color to this to help things make a little more sense. Let's add a body color. So in my CSS, I'm going to add the element selector for my body tag. And I'm going to set the background color to one of my favorite grays, which is hashtag 525252. And so that'll give me a nice gray here. I'll focus my main element selector, and I'll change that background color to white. And I will take my paragraph element selector, and let's change that background color to what would be good? Maybe like a light pink. Should we go with the light pink today? Let's go with like a hashtag FF. Let's see. FFC or FF00CC, maybe something like that. A nice, bright, brilliant magenta. And so that helps us to bring up some points here. Because right now we have two boxes. We have a main box and we have a paragraph box, but you can't really tell it. You can't really tell it, right? Because the width of both boxes is the same by default, right? Because since my paragraph is a child, remember we talked about those DOM relationships earlier on, since my paragraph is a child of my main box, it's going to inherit the default values of that main box. So my main box is only going to grow as big as it needs to accommodate my paragraph. So it's going to be 100% width of the screen and only as tall as it needs to be. So that's why we define width and height for our content box in our box model. Now, one of the things that we'll look at here is that you can see when we look at the edge of this content box, it is right up against that edge. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about breathing room. So we need a little padding for that, but we haven't talked about padding yet. Put a pin in it, come back around to it. So what we want to do here is we want to change the width and height of these boxes to start to manipulate what we have going on here. So as we're just getting started, we're using our static widths. We're just using pixels here. Once we get to some more advanced stuff in some later classes, we'll talk more about making dynamic responsive websites. But just getting started, we make static website with static units. So I'm going to set a new width for my main. I have a 1080p monitor here that this is on, so I can shrink it down to like a 960 pixel width, and it'll be roughly half of the screen. And so we can see it there. So we've changed the width of our parent container. And what happens is the child kind of reflows into that, and it's still just going to be tall enough to accommodate our interior, because we haven't set a height yet. So if we add a height here, by adding a height of, let's say, 600 pixels, we should then see our white box peek out of the bottom here. Now, something that's important to note here is that if you have a lot of text inside of your box, it might be best just to leave the height off. Because as we've said, it's going to adjust to meet the content of the stuff that's in it. So since I'm doing a demonstration here, I want to show you width, and I want to show you height, and I want to show you the different boxes and how they peek in and out. But if I set this height at a 600 pixel height, and then I add more text to my paragraph that takes it outside of that 600 pixel height, it's going to flow out of the box and it's going to look weird. So that's not something that you want to do. So if you're in one of those cases where you have like some changing text values, you might just want to leave the height off, maybe accommodate it with something a little different like the padding. But now I can also change the width and height of this paragraph here. So right now what the width of the paragraph is it's 100% of its parent container. So whatever I change the width of the main parent container to, the paragraph is going to accommodate that until I define it a value. So let's add something in here that'll be just a little bit smaller so we can see a little bit of edge around it. Width 760 pixels. And so with that, we see it change. We can also add some height here, just to give it a little bit more. I'm not going to. I'm just going to leave the height off. But when we're dealing with our content box and the box model, we're dealing with the width and height. So if you ask me, well, what is the width of the main box right now, I can say confidently it's 960 pixels. If you ask me what the height of that main box is right now, since it is defined, I can say confidently that it's 600 pixels. Now, if we look at the paragraph, if you ask me what the width is, I can say it's 760 pixels. But the height right now is undefined because we haven't added a height to it yet. So the height is going to be whatever the height is. Like, we can figure that out if we looked at the inspect element feature and all that kind of stuff. But we're not going to worry about that. So the content box is relatively easy. When we're dealing with the content box, all we're dealing with is just the stuff that's on the inside, just the stuff that you can see. But again, notice that that text is right up against the edge of that box. And we can see everything here just right up against the edge, and that makes it really difficult to read. So let's take a look at the next thing, which is going to be our padding, and see what we can do with this. Now with padding is outside of the content box, but it's still inside of the box of the element. And so its dimensions extend to the padding box width and the padding box height. And the thickness of the padding is determined by padding top, padding right, padding bottom, and padding left. However, we can also write that as a shorthand padding property. And we'll have a look at that. But now when we're looking at padding, we're going to be starting out with the length, just specifying a static length. But you can also use a percentage, which, especially as with where we're at now, that's going to be a little confusing with the way that padding works. We are just sticking to our specified length, which is going to be in pixels, points, centimeters, or whatever. Then there's also inherit that says that the child is going to inherit the parent padding property element. Now with padding, negative values are not allowed. which kind of seems like a weird kind of point to make. But when we get to margin later on, you can use negative values. And so we've got this padding shorthand. And we can write padding, we can write border, we can write margin, all in the same shorthand. And it's important for us to kind of understand this shorthand. And there is, I believe, information on this shorthand in your reading for this week. So if you want to dive into it more, you can look at that. But when we're reading this shorthand, we're reading it like we would read a clock. We're reading it like we go around a clock. So we've got this one padding element here, and it's got 4 properties separated by spaces. And if we were reading this, we would be reading it as top, right, bottom, left. Just like we're going around this clock here. Top, right, bottom, left. So in reading this padding shorthand, that's padding top, 10 pixels, padding right, 12 pixels, padding bottom, 14 pixels, padding left, 16 pixels. Now you might see it sometimes where there's just 2 properties or 3 properties written here. When you have 2 properties or 3 properties, what you're doing is you're taking the adjacent properties that you're not including and you're putting it together with the one that's across it. So let's say I had 3 properties, and this is going to be the one that confuses a lot of people. Let's imagine the 16 pixels on the end here. Let's imagine that's not there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, I have 4 spaces here. I still have 4 spaces, right? Because I have 4 elements. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the one that's left out here on the end, and I'm going to put it with the adjacent side. So in this instance, if I leave out the one on the end, well, we'll take left and move it with right. So in this case, we'd have top of 10 pixels, right and left of 12 pixels, and bottom of 14 pixels. Then if we were to only have 2, we're taking away the bottom off the end. We would move that to go with its adjacent side, which would be the top. So if we only had 2 values here, it would be top and bottom of 10 pixels, right and left of 12 pixels. So that shorthand is pretty important to read. So let's move back over to our box model test here, and let's add some padding to this. So what I want you to do here is I want you to take note of a couple things. I want you to take note of what happens to the inside of my paragraph when I add this padding to it, and what happens to the outside of my box when I add this padding to it. So I'm going to add a little bit of padding here to my paragraph. So I'm going to use the shorthand padding, 12 pixels. Now if I just have one value, that's going to add it to all 4 sides. And so we'll start with just that. And we can look down here and we can see that where that text was right up against the edge of that box, now it's come out a little bit. It's got a little breathing room. But now that I'm zoomed out, watch what happens to the edge of this box when I take that padding away. It shrunk in. it shrinks. Right? When I add it, it gets bigger. And we can make this even more prevalent by adding more size to it. We can see it get bigger. So what's happening when we add padding to our box here is, remember that we said that padding and content are part of the same box, but they're different elements. So what that's doing is that's adding to our initial box size. Our inside box here, where our text is, that's still 760 pixels wide. But now we've added our padding. And our padding adds to the size of our box. And so I ended up adding 36 pixels here. So that's another 36 pixels on this side. That's another 36 pixels on this side. So for the full width of the box that's on our screen now, that's 760 plus 36 plus 36. So let's see, that's 72 plus 760, that's 832. Total pixels wide. And so this is where it kind of starts to get confusing, because when you say width and height, or when you say width in a CSS rule, and I'm like, okay, how wide is this box? Its width is 760 pixels, but it's got 36 pixels of padding all the way around it. How wide is it? You'd be inclined to say, well, 760 pixels, because it says right there, width. But it's not. It's more than that. Border adds to more than that. Margin adds to more than that. When it comes to the amount of space that our box takes up on our screen, each element of the box model adds a little bit to it. So for the interest of time here, I just kind of want to jump ahead, do some more code here just so you can see it. So if we just have one, remember it takes the ones that we leave out and mushes them together. So that's going to be all four sides. If I add some to other parts, it's top, left and right, and then bottom. So now that we, change that, we can see different sizes all the way around. And again, if I add something here, like if I add 50 pixels. So now I have top, 36 pixels, left or right, 12 pixels, bottom, 48 pixels, left, 50 pixels. So if I look at my box here, let me zoom out, that's a little bit too far. That's 50 pixels over here. 12 over here. 36 up here. 48 down here. And the inside, that content part, is still 760. So if I add all this now, that's 50 plus 12 plus 760. That's 822. If I were judging the width. Now the height here is a little bit harder because the height's unknown. But we'd treat the height in the same way if the height was declared. Let's go ahead and add some padding to this. Or rather, add some border to this. Just kind of jumping ahead. Our border, the size of our border, we can treat the same way in terms of the shorthand. The only difference is that we're adding two other properties to our shorthand rule, which is going to be the color and the type of border. So we'll add our border rule. and immediately after you add your sizes. So if we want a different size border on top and bottom than left and right, we would declare one number for top and bottom, one number for left and right. So maybe we say 10 pixels and 3 pixels. Then you put the type of border, whether it's solid, whether it's dashed, whether it's dotted. You should have a list in your reading of all of the different types of borders. Solid is the one that we use most often. And then the color of the border. So we'd want to put some kind of color here, like maybe, what would stand out? Green. So you give your width and height, you give your, and actually if we want to do all of them, we have to separate them. So let's do 10 pixels solid green. And then we could do border left, 3 pixels, and border right, 3 pixels. And we'll make them solid and green as well. So you can define all at once, or you can define one side at a time. And when you define one side at a time, another thing that you can do here is you can make them different colors. So I can make my left and right orange, while my top and bottom is green, which is pretty interesting. You know, we can see that there. Might be a little hard to see now, so I'll zoom in a little bit. We can see that there. You know, you kind of have a mitered corner. You could also like do something fancy, like I could put these as dotted and change them to dotted borders. And you get that dotting there. You know, there's not a lot of particularly useful things here. It's just things that you can do. And depending on the situation, you might want to do it or not. But now we still have our paragraph box right up against the edge of our container box. Now, when we add these sides here, remember that these values add to the box size as well. Don't want to get ahead of myself. Almost got ahead of myself. So it's 760 plus the left and right values from our padding, plus the left and right values from our border. Now we'll add our margin. And our margin will help us get it away from the edge of the main box. So what if we just go ahead and say 12 pixels? That's going to drag it away from the edge of the main box. It's still tight to the top of the box here because of something that we call border collapse. Border collapse is specific to top and bottom. So if we want to like run this number up a little higher, we should get a little bit of space between the top and bottom. Or actually, it's adding it to... Yeah, it's collapsing into the main itself and dragging it down, which is kind of strange. The way we would fix that would be adding padding to our main. So you can add padding or margin to either. It depends on, you know, what you do with, you know, where you're putting your logic in terms of, well, what do I need to do here? Now, one of the most common ways that we center something in HTML is with our margin. So I think that's kind of important to show you. What we would do is we would use our margin shorthand, and we would use 0 margin on the top and bottom, and we would use auto margin on the left and right. And so that's automatically going to bring my box in. So top and bottom gets 0 additional margin. Left and right is automated. If I wanted to add a little more margin here, I could change that top number. And that'll give me more margin. You saw it pull down just a little bit there on the top and bottom. And so this is how we kind of deal with all of that. And with each addition to the different sides, we're adding size to that full box on screen. Because now that I have some margin here, nothing else can really exist in that margin unless I do some special code to it. So the imaginary box that surrounds this is out here. So when we look at width and height, and I ask you, within the confines of our traditional box model, well, what is the width of this element? It's 760 pixels plus the left and right from the padding, plus the left and right from the border, plus the left and right from the margin. And if I'm asking you about height, it's the defined height plus the top and bottom from the padding, plus the top and bottom from the border, plus the top and bottom from the margin. So all of these things come together. But there is one thing that we can do to sort of hack the box model. Because it's kind of complicated looking at all that. And I will ask you, to do the math in your quiz to, add all of the elements together to try to get the size. But that is a little complicated, and we can hack the box model a little bit. And that's with the box sizing CSS rule. So there's a box sizing property in CSS, and that allows the browser to override the usual box model rules. So now, instead of basing the width and height on the content box, we can define where the width and height of an element is defined to. We can set our box sizing to border box, and that is going to change the way that our browser sees this element, and it's going to redefine the size of the box based on that. Now, you'd still have to add margin to account for total size. But let's just see what happens with this. I mean, we can look at an example of it really quickly here. And this is what this is what an example of it kind of filled out looks like. We have this box sizing border box here. But if we head over to the practice that we've been doing here, watch what happens when I enter box-sizing border box right here. It might have been too subtle for you to notice. Let me take it out. And let me add it back in. In this instance, it's a little subtle, but it would probably be more, like if we changed our padding here, it would probably be more evident. Watch what doesn't happen when I change the width of the padding here. When I change the width of my padding, since I've set box sizing border box, the actual width of my element is not changing. It's staying the same. It's staying at this 760 pixels wide. And then it's accommodating the other elements that I put into it, padding and border. Because instead of the content box that our base width goes to, it's now going to the border box, because that's what we've defined. So when I set the 760 pixels here, instead of being bound by the content box guidelines, once I add this box sizing border box here, it's now bound to the border guidelines. So that's significant, and that's a way to kind of hack kind of hack the box model. Now, if we were in class, I would show you this, and I would tell you to tell me the full width of this box using the box model. So I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to do something interesting here because we're approaching the 1 hour mark. And I want to see who's out there watching. So if you complete this, if you tell me, if you send me an email with the answer to this question, what is the width of this box that we have on the screen here, this hypothetical HTML element, if you send me an email with the answer to that question, what the full width of that box would be on the screen, using our understanding of the box model, I will add 5 points to your Module 3 quiz. The deadline for answering that will be Sunday at midnight, along with your assignments. Send me an email with the answer to that question, and I will add 5 points to your Module 3 quiz. And so that's where we'll stop for today. That's just a little interesting test there to see who's watching, see who's paying attention. That's where we'll stop for today. So with that being said, I'll hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes, just in case anybody has any questions. If you're watching this later and you have any questions, please send me an email. That's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.